Welcome. In this lesson, we're going to be taking a look at Kenneth Burke. So Kenneth Burke is going to give us another method. We've been looking at basically different ways of doing our analysis. Kenneth Burke is going to give us actually two ways of doing that analysis, and we're going to take a look at those. But first, before we do that, let's take a quick step back and do a really quick review so that we all can put in context what it is that Burke is actually going to be offering us, all right? So you know that if you're going to do your job as a critical analyst and a rhetorical critic, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to go in, you're going to have to, the first thing you got to do is tell us what it is you're working with. So that's essentially what the rhetorical critic does first. They describe the artifact. Describing the artifact just simply means you make it clear to us what it is you are working with. And once we know what you're working with, you will then analyze that artifact. So once you've described your artifact, told us what you're working with, you're going to step in and you're going to do an analysis of that artifact. When that's finished, you're going to make some kind of a judgment. You're going to interpret, you're going to evaluate the artifact. You're going to do that based on the insights that you found during analysis. So your analysis should lead naturally to your judgments, to your interpretation and evaluation. And it should be a case that it reads like one complete paper, not like three separate papers. So when you finish with your analysis and you're going down to make your judgments, these need to be connected. Those need to have the same backbone, if you will, that will show us that they're all part of the same set of ideas, that when you told us about the artifact you're going to look at, and then you looked at it, looking at that artifact led to these judgments. They should be coherent and tied together. You will remember also that we've defined criticism as a process of making reasoned judgments. Now, making those reasoned judgments is pretty straightforward and pretty clear. It comes from our method. A method, remember, is just a set of very specific directions that's going to help you do the analysis. It's going to help you think about it. It's going to help you reason through. It's going to help you consider your artifact. That's the job of the method. The method is going to guide your analysis. It's the analysis step. Method and analysis go together. When you follow your method, it's going to show you things about your artifact. And those should be things that you have not noticed before. The goal of the artifact is to present you insights. Those insights show you elements of your artifact that you hadn't noticed, similarities or differences, patterns that appear and occur in your artifact. And the goal there is to basically help you see and understand your artifact more clearly, to bring it into focus so that we have a clearer sense of what is happening here. That's what a method should give us. It should give us a sense of what's happening here in a way that allows us to, of course, bridge over to those judgments. Because once we have seen our artifact more clearly, we're in a position where we can make judgments. And those judgments will be rooted, as we've said, in what we found in our method. So we're going to interpret and evaluate based on what our method showed us about our artifact. Now, you have been taught a series of different methods. All right? You have been introduced to a number of different methods. Essentially, you've been introduced to the classical method, but you've also met several other methods. Since introduction to the classical method, we've also been introduced to Toulmin with his data and claims and warrants. You've met the new rhetoric, Perlman and Ulbricht's Titeka. You have struggled with the universal audience there in the new rhetoric. You've also met narrative analysis with Fisher, and we've talked about metaphoric analysis as well. The thing that you need to remember is that classical method, that classical method that we started out with, that is what you're going to be using for essay 1A and 1B. Both of those essays are going to be done with the classical method. However, essay 2 any of these other methods that we have talked about, you can use for Essay 2. You cannot use the classical method for Essay 2, but you can use any of these methods down here for Essay 2. Those can guide you. They can be your set of instructions for how to analyze your next artifact, whatever artifact you are going to choose for yourself in your second essay. Now, I started out saying we're going to introduce Burke. Okay, Burke can also fit into this group. So you can use Burke as well. So if you wanted to, Burke can be added to that number 6. So we're going to get to know Burke a little bit in this lesson, and then you get to add him to your list. And actually, he's going to be, as we mentioned earlier, he'll be 6 and 7, or if you wish, 6A and 6B, because we're going to pick up 2 different methods from Burke and Burke's writings and thought, and we'll talk about each of those. So let's introduce you to Burke just a little bit so you can come to know who Burke is and get a sort of sense of what he's doing with his sometimes strange approach to criticism. So Burke went to Columbia University. He was a brilliant undergraduate student and therefore was failing all of his classes and left. Well, I don't know if he was failing all of his classes, but he decided that that kind of education wasn't for him. So he dropped out of Columbia University. As a young man in the 20s, he went to work for a magazine called Dial, and he went to work as a critic for the drama. So he wrote up about the plays that were being performed in town, and he would go in and critique those plays. Now, Burke, having left school, that left a mark on his writing and on his reflections. Everything he writes as an adult has the mark of a mind that is incredibly sharp. I mean, he's clearly brilliant, a very fecund mind. He can draw things together. Things seem to germinate in his thoughts, and they grow together. He sees syntheses. He's great. He's brilliant. But all of his writing is also sometimes really hard to get through because he never got that formal education. He never got the discipline necessary to write in that way with clarity. But he was quite the drama critic. He was fascinated with drama, and in fact, he became increasingly captivated by what he saw inside the world of drama. So he would be in and he would be doing his writing and so forth. That drama work brought him to a place where he said, wow, I go in and I watch these plays, and they're the same play. Every play I go in and see. I mean, okay, so there's some variation, sure. But honestly, Burke begins to say to himself, there are actually very few limited patterns, and all the good stories follow them. All the really good stories, they follow the same set of patterns. Let's talk about those patterns that all good stories compose here. And let's get a look at those. Essentially, the kinds of patterns that Burke is thinking about are things like possession, loss, and then that's followed by this climax of recovery. Okay? That's the kind of pattern that Burke is thinking of. Now, it's very general, it's very generic, but it's very recognizable. You can think of movies you've seen that follow this particular arc. And Burke says this is fundamental stuff. It's really, really at the core of the kinds of stories we tell ourselves all over the world, everywhere. There's the darkness, followed by some kind of painful experience that leads to insight. And that darkness can be the kind of darkness that exists for us inside, or it might be the kind of darkness that exists for us in the situation or the circumstance. It might be some kind of ignorance that we have, but it's some kind of block that keeps us from understanding, and we pass through painful experiences after which we understand better, and we have insight. That's how it works. Well, there's also a very similar pattern, right? We have that same darkness it can be inside, it can be outside, but that same darkness appears, But instead of some kind of painful experience leading to insight, we have some kind of growing resentment that bubbles up inside of us, and it leads to retaliation. That's another story that we tell. Think of Edgar Allan Poe's Cask of Amontillado. Wow, there's nothing if not that exact arc right there, where somebody is carrying a sort of darkness inside of them that has been growing and fermenting until it leads to a sort of horrifying retaliation, right? And, there's the peril arc, where after peril, once we face certain danger, we come to understand something. The danger clarifies our sight, and it leads us to take actions that, of course, result in security. That's another. So, in a case like this, and these can be realistic stories. They can be wild fictions, fantasies, and this is a story about, a dragon that is going to destroy the village. And yet we discover that, in fact, there is a magic sword. And that magic sword is the only thing that can kill the dragon. And so we march ourselves up into the mountains. We discover the magic sword. We come back and in the nick of time, of course, we destroy the dragon and we reestablish our security. Here's what Burke finds about these. You'll notice that as you look at these, darkness and insight and insight, possession and security, there are a lot of parallels here and a lot of shared events in these various kinds of plots, if you will, that he's seeing in all these stories. And what that leads Burke to do is he begins to do some comparison. And he says, after reading and reading and reading, and he did a lot of reading, he says, these dramatic patterns that I see, they're somewhat adaptable, but they are amazingly consistent. And they're consistent not just in the plays I'm watching today. They're consistent across time. They're constant. They're universal. I see exactly the same patterns in Chinese opera that I see in the Grimm's fairy tale. I see exactly the same kind of pattern in contemporary cinema as I see in ancient Greek cinema. The patterns themselves, these arcs, these dramas are, and this is not an exhaustive list, this is just a few examples, but these patterns, these dramas are in fact simply an aspect of what it means to be human. In fact, Burke calls them an innate form of the mind. These patterns are innate forms of the mind. They are everywhere. They cut across culture. They cut across time. They cut across languages. The same patterns you see over and over again, and they are so common, and they are across so many different various cultures that Burke says this is just the innate way the human mind engages in culture, in life. He will come to say that these patterns, they are inherent in the very germplasm of living out a human life. That's just how human life is. We come to know these things. And Burke says we come to know them from the earliest days. So this possession, loss, recovery, Burke says you knew that. You knew that, before you were a year old. You had your pacifier, and you were content and you were happy with your pacifier because you possessed what you wanted for happiness. And then gravity came, and it stole your pacifier. You lost it. It fell out of your mouth, and you could not know where it was, and you were in turmoil, and you suffered terribly. But someone came to rescue you. Your mom or your dad or one of your siblings. They came along and they returned the loss. What you once had was recovered and returned. And Burke says, that kind of experience, that's what we're doing. That's what drama is. Drama draws exactly those kinds of experiences from our earliest days. This is simply how human beings order and put together the experiences of their humanity. They do it basically through these kinds of dramas. Dramas express how it is to simply be human in the world. Now here's the thing. If these are the patterns that all good stories follow, Burke is very, very captivated by this idea. This is simply how we human beings live in the world. It's what it means to be human. And these are incredibly powerful good stories that we tell. This is how good stories work. Now, you need to contextualize this because Burke is writing in the late 20s and early 30s. And so there are some other stories that are starting to show up. In the 1920s, Adolf Hitler releases the first volume of Mein Kampf. It means my struggle, my war. Hitler was laying out in his Mein Kampf the plan he had for taking Germany back to the era before the First World War. The First World War had been particularly costly and painful for Germany. Long story short, they had lost a whole lot and they were bankrupt. And Hitler appeared on the scene and promised to set things right again. That was his goal. That's what he set out to do. And in Mein Kampf, Hitler lays out quite plainly what the plan is. The plan is 3/7 fever dream. There's just a whole lot of crazy in it. But there are these other moments of just terrifying clarity where Hitler taps into an understanding, and it's intuitive. It's an intuitive understanding of how to get large groups of people to do things. Some things they might not at first think are a good idea. But Hitler's talking about how to change people's minds and how to get large groups to act in a certain way. When Hitler begins to talk about how the country, the culture, the world will respond to his new ideas, he talks about it being very important that those ideas be presented in a certain way. And that certain way is really scary because he seems to understand and anticipate virtually everything about how to manipulate large groups. He seems to tap in intuitively to what the kind of rhetorical drama would be that could mobilize an entire country. When Burke gets his hands on and he reads Mein Kampf in the middle 30s, Burke is terrified. In fact, Burke will write a review of Hitler's Mein Kampf called The Rhetoric of Hitler's Battle, and it'll be released in 1939. In this, one of the things that Burke lays out with terrifying accuracy, as it turns out, is Burke is aware that what Hitler is doing is taking these dramatic patterns that are this universal constant, that are innate, that are inherent in the very process of living out your human life. And Burke realizes Hitler has tapped into exactly those dramatic narrative stories and has done it in a way that creates, Burke is clear, Hitler is going to create a massive movement because he's tapping into these ideas that more or less define who we are. They are core to our identity, these narrative structures, these dramas that Burke has been seeing, these patterns of drama. Burke says these are the way we understand our identity. And what you find in Hitler, in Mein Kampf, is that Hitler plans on picking up those universal constant forms and using them to empower his Nazi movement. He's planning on creating a social enactment, a real-life drama that taps in, Burke immediately sees, to to these innate forms in the mind. And therefore, when Mein Kampf taps into these innate forms in the mind that are just the core of our identity, Burke says that kind of rhetoric is going to be incredibly powerful and frightening. Now that brings us to this idea of a few limited patterns that all good stories follow. Now, Burke's got a problem all of a sudden, because when he looks at Mein Kampf, he knows perfectly well he's not looking at a good story. And yet it's a story that is, in fact, tapping into those very things that Burke says make rhetoric work, those few limited patterns that more or less shape our identity. Those are what empower rhetoric. They're what make rhetoric work. Okay, so now what? Well, rhetoric we have defined as the artistic use of language to build convictions with enthymemes. That is to say, we build our convictions, our beliefs, our trust, our faith. We put our faith in things. We get persuaded by things because language is used well to build those convictions. And enthymemes, remember, are just any reasons that are given to embrace convictions. Burke is watching the artistic use of language over here. And he's very concerned about what it's doing. When Burke looks at rhetoric and he thinks about rhetoric, he understands that rhetoric works in politics, and it works in religion and relationships and aesthetics, all those areas that we have talked about as well. These are the arenas in which we form our convictions, as you know at this point in the semester. But Burke's idea that there are good stories that come out of our identification with these constant universals that are inherent in our very act of living, those good stories require a different kind of assessment now. What they require is a way to take into account what Burke is looking at when he turns his attention to the terrible things that Adolf Hitler is putting together. When he finishes his rhetoric of Hitler's battle, he's up here and he's assessing this idea that, oh wow, these are the patterns, these are the dramas, this is the way to make good stories. And he realizes that's not going to work. His idea of this is the limited pattern that make good stories, he begins to reshape, and he begins to understand, oh, these limited patterns don't make good stories. This is not a good story. They make powerful stories. You can use them, Burke comes to understand, to do terrible things, not just good things. And that's going to set Burke on a quest to understand for the rest of his life. He's going to be trying to understand how we're going to be able to unpack and get back to this idea of making sure the stories are not just powerful, but also good in some way. And the only way we're going to be able to do that, Burke thinks, is by trying to assess our motives and figure out how human beings put together motives. Powerful rhetoric can be used for evil things. He's trying to think now of a way to get to good rhetoric, and that's going to require us to assess human motives. When Burke writes as an adult and a scholar and a genius, he's writing about how language is functioning at this level of creating sort of universal dramas. Now, when we say universal drama in these patterns, remember, Burke is clear. These patterns are very particular. They change, okay? The kinds of things that you need to do to have insight to solve the problem of darkness in one culture might of course be a different kind of story than what you would have in another culture. So the Greeks have an idea of how to create honor, and that is different from what you get in the medieval stories. The medieval stories have a very different idea of what it means to be honorable. Okay, so in the Greeks, it's going out and taking what you want and being a man's man, and it's to some degree it's not entirely. It's a little unfair. But to some degree, it kind of taps into that idea that we would have today of toxic masculinity. The Middle Ages has some of that, of course, but boy, has an entirely different approach on how to become a hero, right? Because in the Middle Ages, you can be a hero by being a powerless monk. It's not about asserting yourself. It's about submitting to some kind of honor that will form and shape you, whether it's divine or whether it comes out of the state or wherever. So, I mean, he understands there are differences in the culture. So he's not naive, our genius Burke. He's not being naive about the idea that these are universal patterns. He just wants to emphasize that when you step back from the particulars, the patterns stay the same. And that leads him to look at language from a variety of different ways that cut across a lot of our classifications today. He's not exactly a postmodernist, but he's not exactly a classicist. He's certainly not a modernist, although he talks, he just doesn't fit very comfortably and well, to be frank, into almost any of our definitions today. He's not really, he's kind of crazy liberal in some ways. He's kind of crazy conservative in other ways. And when I say crazy, I don't mean, he seems almost an extreme liberal on some issues and almost an extreme conservative on others. He just does not fit comfortably, and I think that happens often with people who have a lot going on up here. They tend not to fit comfortably into a lot of our common classifications. But when he begins to look at drama and look at language, he gives us a lot of different insights. We're going to spend time looking particularly at two. All right, dramatism and logology, they go together. So dramatism and logology, that's what we're going to look at. And a second analysis option that he gives us is cluster analysis. We're going to start with cluster analysis in this lesson, and then we will go back and pick up dramatism and logology in the next lesson. So, cluster analysis, and this is option 1 of Burke. All right, cluster analysis is option 1 of Burke. Basically, in cluster analysis, we have a single goal. The idea behind this particular method, and now we are talking about a very specific method, the idea behind this method is to isolate the motive that led to this rhetoric. That's what Burke is after. You saw the title on the previous slide, the title of one of his famous books, The Rhetoric of Motive. He wants to talk about how the artistic use of language, and he means language broadly, the artistic use of language structures our motives, our reasons for doing things. The goal here is going to be identify and evaluate. Okay, so I hope you hear this is that final step in the critical process. After analysis, you're going to identify and evaluate the worldview, the perspectives that went into making this particular artifact. The real reason you're doing this, evaluating the worldview and the perspectives, is because Burke believes that with this method, cluster analysis, you're going to be able to focus in on and actually recognize and identify the motive that brought about this particular artifact by this particular author. That's what he believes you're going to be able to do. Now, there is an absolute pay dirt question that you are going to use. So this is the question right here that will introduce your evaluation if you do cluster analysis. If you do cluster analysis, this is what you're going to ask yourself when you transition out of analysis and into making your judgments, making your inferences, making your interpretation and evaluation. The question is this: given the way certain terms, specific terms, have specific meanings for this rhetor, what was the motive for producing this rhetoric in this way likely to have been? Okay, if that is kind of weird and you don't quite follow that, hang on, because we're going to go through and we're going to talk about these terms and this rhetor and motive in a little bit more depth and detail. But in order to do that, we're going to need to understand some really important vocabulary. that is part of this method. All right? 3 big ones. First of all, there's identification. That's a huge and absolutely essential term and idea inside cluster analysis. Key terms. That's the core of cluster analysis right there. You got to know what the key terms are. And then there are the clusters. So those are the 3 things you got to do. All right? Obviously, if that's the important vocabulary, we need to look at that important vocabulary a little bit more carefully and closely. We'll pick them up in order. We'll talk about identification, key terms, and clusters. So here are the terms that you've got to understand if you want to do cluster analysis. Identification. In essence, here's what you get with identification. Burke says, look, you can't persuade somebody until you are able to tap into their own understanding of themselves and show how your ways, your proposals, your claims, even the way you live your life, is in some way connected with that other person. People are not persuaded by absolute otherness. That doesn't do it. Burke says the only way you're going to manage to understand what's going on in rhetoric is to look at what it is that a person is being offered in terms of identity. Your message, the rhetor's message, the artifact you're looking at, is tapping into somebody's identity in a way that allows them to take whatever they think of as the core of their own definition and unite it to your particular plan. That's what rhetoric will do. And Burke is going to tell you that's what cluster analysis will show you. Cluster analysis will show you what identification is being offered. And that's going to be one of the key ways you will come to understand and to debate, to understand and to explain the debate that's happening inside this artifact. You look at what an audience is being asked to identify with. That's going to reveal motives. That's what Burke is going to tell you. The second huge vocabulary term that you got to work with here, key terms. Now, a key term is what Burke says it's the most important word or words in the artifact. Now, words in quotes, because of course, if you're doing a cluster analysis of, a medieval cathedral, then it's not the words, it's the images, it's the angles, it's maybe the light. There are a lot of things that can serve as words. Words in quote here, Burke is thinking of logos. He's thinking of that idea that, what is it that comes in here and orders this, keeps it in place, makes it make sense. And Burke says you got to find the most important words in the artifact. That's what you got to do. Find the key terms. Find the words that are actually important. Okay, well, that's great advice. How? How do you do that? Oh, Burke says, it's easy. According to Burke, nothing to it. There are 2 ways to find the significant words. Frequency and intensity. That's how you do it. You literally count all the words inside the artifact, and you find the ones that show up the most often. Those are significant words. Those are key terms. Find the key terms by finding the words that happen most often. Now, obviously, we're not talking here about the and a and an. We're talking about basically nouns and verbs and adjectives and adverbs, okay? We're not, the word of or the is going to show up, a lot more than anything else. But Burke says frequency of terms that have significance, terms that have meaning. That's what you're after. Or Burke says there's this other way that key terms show up. Now, maybe you've got a term that does not happen very often, but The few times it happens, wow, it's like a gut punch. It's carefully planned. Maybe it only happens once. But when it happens, it hits hard. That is intensity. So Burke says you got to read your text. You've got to examine your artifact really carefully. You got to find the terms that keep showing up, and you got to find the ones that don't show up very often, but when they do, they pack a punch. That is how you find your key terms. Now, when you find key terms, Burke says, understand those key terms are going to come in sort of two groups. All right, there are two kinds of key terms. Both of these are, can be discovered either through frequency or through intensity. They are what Burke calls God terms or devil terms. He's not talking here in religion. He's not referring in any way to religious terminology here. He just means by God terms the highest ideals, the most defining aspect of your identity. That's what he means by a God term. So when he wants you to recognize a God term, well, maybe you find it because it's a very frequent term. Maybe you find it because it shows up freedom, and it shows up only at a place that's very intense. But what Burke is going to tell you is that God term is the most powerful term. It's the term of all the other terms. It is the highest goal, the clearest ideal, the thing that most touches your identity. That's a God term. A devil term, not surprisingly, is exactly the opposite, right? The devil term is simply a term that, in fact, dismisses whatever is clearest, cleanest about your identity. Whatever it is that most would unmake you, that would be central to you having lost all contact with who you are, that's a devil term. So maybe the devil term is communism. It is for Ronald Reagan, right? Maybe the devil term is slavery. Maybe the devil term is poverty. So the devil term can be almost anything. The God terms can be almost anything. But what makes them God terms, or what makes them devil terms, is that they are the ones that are most closely linked up with your understanding of who you are. That is what makes them God terms or devil terms. And if you find key terms that seem to emerge as God terms or devil terms, then you are getting closer and closer and closer to the question of motive. All right, that's what you're after. Now, we've said identification. That's certainly one clear, clean thing that you've got to understand in Burke. If you're going to see how cluster analysis works, you kind of understand now why. The key terms, the most significant words, those are crucial. But once you find those key terms, we're ready for a different question. Clusters pick up the idea of the key terms, and then what they do is they begin to look at these ideas that seem to gather around those key terms. In fact, understanding those ideas may help you understand whether you're looking at a God term or a devil term. But clusters are this. They're this set of key term plus the ideas that seem to appear whenever this key term shows up. So if freedom is your key term, and if it's perhaps close to a God term, what you begin to do is you begin to say, okay, wow, freedom occurs very frequently in this artifact. Let me look around. When freedom comes up, what else am I seeing? What gets associated with that key term? That is to say, what gets identified with that key term? That's your cluster. And that's what you're going to analyze. That's the core of your analysis. So your cluster is a key term plus the ideas that seem to get associated with that key term. That set constitutes a cluster. This is where you will, in fact, find yourself most likely to make inroads. Okay, you're going to discover really, really important stuff when you begin to put your clusters together. Now, clusters, the ideas that frequent around those clusters, you want to look for patterns in those frequency. I mean, in rhetorical criticism, we're all about patterns, right? So you want to find ideas that hopefully, ideally, the ideas that are clustering around your key term of freedom would be ideas that have a lot in common and that you wouldn't find scattered everywhere else inside your artifact. That's kind of the gold standard. Now, that never happens, fully, but it's kind of the gold standard of what you're after. Now, ideas that cluster around your key terms. Understand, your key term might be a God term, or your key term might be a devil term. They could go either way, but you really want to focus on these ideas that get clustered around them in order to get a sense of what it is you're actually dealing with. So those are the 3 steps to doing cluster analysis. First thing you do is you identify your key terms. And you do that basically through frequency or intensity. Keep an eye out especially for God terms and devil terms. Once you've identified your key terms, you start looking for the clusters. Now, clusters, remember, and key terms, they're closely related. But you need the cluster. You need the key term and the ideas that have been gathering around that key term. Burke sometimes talks about key terms as if they were a magnet, and they draw in these other ideas that have certain polarities, that have certain directions or commonalities. All right, so your freedom might draw in your freedom. If freedom is your key term, perhaps it will draw in the idea of security. Perhaps it will draw in the idea of maybe it will draw in the idea of love. Okay, so security and love. Freedom might also draw in the idea of honor. Okay, so these are the kinds of ideas that we might see clustering around freedom. If we have a keyword like freedom, we might also see ideas clustering around it that are in opposition to that key term. So you might see freedom, but every time freedom comes up, there is the idea of threat. There's the possibility of slavery. There's the idea of chaos. There's the idea. So we might have a key term, maybe one of our own God terms like freedom, and we begin to talk about freedom. The ideas that get associated with it are actually very scary ideas, like freedom may not survive. Okay, that's the cluster. That's the cluster. That's the pay dirt. Now, once you have gone that far, remember that the clustered ideas, hopefully, will be somewhat similar to each other, but different from other things in the artifact. That's, again, the pay dirt. That's kind of what we're hoping for, all right? So, identify your key terms, frequency and intensity. Look for the clusters, get those key terms, and then figure out what the ideas are, especially the kind of similar ideas that are gathering around, similar to each other, that are gathering around your key term. Once you have that in place, you're ready to take another step. You're ready to reveal the motives. This is where you're going to interpret and evaluate. Now, what are you interpreting and evaluating as you start this process? Now, remember, Burke is kind of messy on those borders we've been talking about here's analysis and then here's making your judgments. Here's analysis, then here's interpretation and evaluation. Okay, Burke is gonna kind of, he doesn't have a hard, fast line between discovering clusters and revealing motives. This is kind of all going to blend together for him. So you may have a harder time drawing out an absolute break But there's a difference here between discovering the clusters and mapping the ideas that are around the clusters. Mapping your clusters is how the language often goes. And when you reach this place where you are revealing motives by interpreting and evaluating. What are you interpreting and evaluating? The key terms and the ideas that are around them. So here, in the analysis, you're more or less discovering these. You're showing us what they are. And then when we get down to talking about the motives, when we're going to interpret and evaluate, we're going to look at these clusters and begin to see what is it that they mean. And we're going to try to figure that out with that really magic question. Now we can understand that question maybe a little bit better. Given that these terms, okay, the key terms, have these meanings for this rhetor. Okay, how do we know what meaning that key term has? We look at the ideas that keep clustering around it. Don't listen. Pay no attention when a rhetor defines a key term for you. Burke says that's just a shell game. That doesn't count. That's not real understanding of the key term. If you want the real understanding of the key term, look at the ideas that keep popping up whenever that key term is used. That's how you understand what the meaning is. So given that you can think of these key terms, have the meanings that are shown to us by the clusters, by the things that cluster around that key term, given that these key terms have the meanings that are shown to us by the ideas that cluster around them, so this rhetor thinks that key term has this meaning, then what do you think the motive was for producing rhetoric like this? What do you think the likely motive was? That's the question that gets you into making your judgment calls. Given what we have learned about how these key terms have meaning, what do you think the rhetor was up to? Because these, Burke would say, the clustered ideas that gather around the key term, they tell us what the key term means to this rhetor. So given that this rhetor thinks this term has this meaning, what do you think their motive was? That is what Burke wants you to get to. Now, these are the steps of doing a cluster analysis. We showed you a book earlier. Burke had a book, The Rhetoric of Motive. He's got another one too, The Grammar of Motives. I'm telling you, he's obsessed with this idea of motivation, right? He wants to ferret out. He wants to understand motives. He says here are 3 ways to understand motives. Identify what your key terms are. Discover the clusters that have gathered around that key term. That will reveal the motives. If you can think clearly about these clusters, you'll come to understand motives, even the secret motives that are present to this rhetoric. You do that with the magic question. Given what we've learned about how these key terms have meaning to this particular rhetorician, then what was the likely motive for putting this rhetoric together in this way? And Burke wants you to make judgments. He wants you to make a judgment call about the quality of the motive. Okay, now this is a guy, remember, who started out down this path saying, okay, how in the world do you respond to the rhetoric of somebody like Hitler? And it wasn't an academic question in his world, right? He was watching World War II unfold around him. And he said, how do we find a way to critique the motives, even of powerful rhetoric? Well, he says, I got a way. Do a cluster analysis. Identify the key terms. Discover what the clusters are there. When you study those clusters, you'll discover the motives of this person. And if those motives are terrible, you need to call a spade and say, those are terrible motives. Don't listen to this person. All right. What can we tell you about cluster analysis in general then? Well, a few things. One, cluster analysis is going to work better on larger texts. Okay, this is not the kind of thing that is going to be a real heavy hitter if you're doing a 200-word editorial in the newspaper. It's not going to be it's not going to be the kind of thing you can do with a commercial. All right, they're just too small, so there's not enough space for things to cluster together. Okay, you need space for these things to gather together. So Burke is saying, look for something larger to work with. Look for an entire movie. Look for, 2 or 3 chapters out of a novel, or maybe an entire novel, not an editorial in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. Cluster analysis needs space. It's got to stretch to work. So look for larger texts. That's one thing to tell you. Here's another thing to tell you. Remember your key terms and your clusters. They can be similar to each other, or they can be what Burke calls agonistic. Agonistic is where they come into conflict with each other. So remember, we talked about you might have a keyword like freedom, but the clusters around it are peril, danger, risk, failure, suffocation. These might be the kinds of things that are clustering around this idea of freedom. Now, that's either going to mean, when you have an agonistic cluster like that, that's either going to mean that in the reader's mind, these two things, freedom and these ideas clustering around freedom that are like threats and suffocation and fear, those two things are in conflict in the reader's mind, and they're trying to tell you how to resolve the conflict, which side of the conflict you need to be on. Or it means that the reader is not clear about what they really believe. That's another option too. The rhetoric is saying one thing, but down deep inside, they actually believe something else. The rhetor themselves is in conflict, and that's why you don't get clarity. Clusters are designed to tap into issues of identity. You can't emphasize this enough. The clusters reveal the identity that is being touched on, that's being called to, that's being summoned. Okay? There's an identity that the clusters show. They give you what you're supposed to be at your core if you walk into this rhetoric. Okay? That's central. It's inescapable, and it's one of the things that you are making a judgment call about. You are fixating on motive. All right? You are fixating on the motive for this rhetoric. And how is that motive leading to a certain kind of identity? That's what you've got to answer. Now, Burke believes that this method is going to show you the motives of the rhetor. And he thinks even if the motives are unconscious, he thinks his method can get you to even the unconscious motives of the rhetor. Motives the rhetor's appealing to that the rhetor does not understand. The rhetor may not even know their own motives clearly. And this method might, in fact, probably will, almost certainly will, if depending on which chapter of Burke you're reading at that moment, this method will get you insight, will reveal, will lay bare even the unconscious motives that are hidden from the rhetor, the author of the artifact. Okay, that is cluster analysis. Burke has another way of looking at language and looking at rhetoric, and that other way is dramatism, sometimes called logology. Sometimes it's simply called the pentad, but the pentad is simply the first step in the dramatism logology story. That's going to be coming up in our next lesson. If you would like to look at cluster analysis a little bit more carefully, and if you want to see some examples of it, go into Canvas for the readings that are due this week. And those readings contain 2 examples of cluster analysis. One of them is simply a student description of how cluster analysis works. And I think the student description is going to lay out 4 steps instead of the 3 we've laid out here. Don't worry about that. You'll see that basically they're trying to break apart one step. But basically look through it because it gives you a sense of how these methods ought to be described in a student paper. And then there's another that's an article that uses cluster analysis to look at a debate and a discussion that's going on, or that was going on, ages ago now. But it's a cluster analysis that's done on a very vivid debate back in the middle of the last century. So you can take a look at that as well. So there's an example of cluster analysis there, and there's a student paper that describes how cluster analysis works. Feel free to take a look at those. Next time we do a lesson, we'll be picking up this idea of dramatism and logology, and we'll be looking at that method more closely.